Okay, they back down. Let's talk about some Dungeons and Dragons. Hello, my name is Hunter, the movie reviewing horse, because when it comes to cinema, humans cannot be trusted. I'm also not fond of illithids. And if you watched our D&D show, you would know why. Tabletop role-playing games are slowly becoming more popular than anime. Okay, maybe we can't go that far just yet, but you get the idea. It's gaining a lot of traction. Right now, tabletop role-playing games are more popular than ever, and right at the center of this craze is Dungeons and Dragons, and Pathfinder, and Call of Cthulhu, and Vampire the Masquerade, and Starfinder, and the Fallout Pen and Paper, and Cyberpunk? Regardless of what tabletop game you're playing right now, Dungeons and Dragons is definitely center stage, or at least this is the one that everybody associates with tabletop. And even then, it's still really popular. We play Dungeons and Dragons. College Humor plays Dungeons and Dragons. Matt Mercer plays Dungeons and Dragons. Calliope Mori probably plays Dungeons and Dragons, even if Mythbreakers was based off of Chronicles of Darkness. Unfortunately, Dungeons & Dragons has been in a lot of hot water this year. If you watched our impressions video on the Dungeons & Dragons movie, no? Okay, we'll wait. Okay, everybody's on the same page now. In that video, you may recall I was calling for a boycott. Well, not anymore. The situation changed very, very abruptly. Not only did they back down with the changes to the open game license, but they also decided that most of their stuff is now going to be Creative Commons, as they always should have been. Now, to be fair, they were facing down an entire community, not just Dungeons and Dragons, because the open game license covers so much more. An entire community came together to stop this from happening. We're not just a collection of giant nerds, even though we are a collection of giant nerds, but we're not gonna take this lying down. Before they backed down, I wasn't even gonna review this movie, but then they did. So I got tickets to opening night and this really, really nice popcorn bucket. It's still going to take a lot of time to rebuild the trust that was there before, but between the Creative Commons thing and backing down with the open game license, it's a start. So I guess we can review the movie. Mostly doing it because of this popcorn bucket, though. God, this thing is cool! I feel like filmmakers have been struggling to figure out how to turn Dungeons & Dragons into a movie for a really long time now. How do you condense a D&D campaign into a movie? I suppose you could do a one-shot, but ideally, in real time, that's gonna blow through in about 20 minutes. I mean, think about it. How long did it take the Wild Whirlwinds to figure out pyramid schemes and beat down Mitch McConnell? Yeah, you really gotta go watch Dungeons & Dorkheads for context on that. We started hearing about this last July at San Diego Comic-Con. A little bit after that, we actually got a teaser for it. Like, an hour after that. They were there to promote the movie. Actual trailers followed pretty soon after that, and actually, they had a spot on the Super Bowl, so rock on. It wasn't all smooth sailing for this movie, though. Not by any stretch of the imagination. They announced this back in 2013, and whoa, 2013 was a different time. Dungeons & Dragons didn't have the mainstream reach that it does now. Also, that announcement was coming from Warner Brothers. Soon after, Hasbro sued them. After that, this jumped around in development hell for a while until finally it landed with Paramount. And then they had the aforementioned fiasco with the open game license. And believe me, boycotting the film, not my original idea. because a lot of other creators were calling for the exact same thing. Now, I'm no expert, but I think it would be very, 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 very hard to sell a film to a fan base that hates you, no matter how cool the popcorn bucket looks. And they had no one to blame for the situation but themselves, because it was entirely their fault. We can only hope that they actually realize that in time. Because between this and the natural stigma that still does exist against Dungeons & Dragons, it wasn't looking good for this movie. And dropping the open game license changes might have come just a little too late. Marketing campaign could have gone better. And they're probably gonna turn around and try to change the open game license again in 2 years. But they are sitting on a 91 and a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, so they must have done something right. Honor Among Thieves is in a rather interesting position. On one hand, it's been given the daunting task of trying to bring back Dungeons & Dragons movies, a series of movies that don't have a great reputation. Seriously, none of them can break a 5 on IMDb, guys, alright? The poster for Book of Vile Darkness looks like something Asylum made. And on the other hand, tabletop role-playing games are in the best place that they have ever been in since they came about. So the production staff figured, you know what, maybe we should try with this one. And that's why it's sitting on a 7.6 on IMDb. It broke the 5, guys! It's marvelous what you can accomplish when you put more than $12 million towards your fantasy movie. Warner Brothers. They don't have a great reputation right now either. It just goes to show you, it's funny how things can turn around really quickly. Warner Brothers turned around and betrayed everyone. Wizards of the Coast turned around and gave us everything under Creative Commons and said sorry. This movie turned around and said, let's try and actually make a movie. Significant improvement over the first movie, I might add, because, like, the first movie I saw a dungeon and I saw a dragon. There are at least 3 dragons in this one. As for dungeons, they go to the fucking Underdark in this movie. How much more dungeon do you want? I feel like this was the first hurdle that this movie had to overcome, was it actually had to be Dungeons and Dragons. Even if your dungeon is a giant maze, it is still technically a dungeon. Even if it's this piece of shit. This was not fun to navigate through. Though, to be fair, it could be worse. But that's the thing about Dungeons and Dragons, is that it's flexible. You can have your methodically thought out and well-balanced dungeons, or you can just have a maze. So in turn, I feel like this movie also needs to be flexible. It can't be afraid to shy away from its own fan base and try to appeal to a larger crowd, or it can't try to ease away from its own universe. Which this is set in the original Dungeons & Dragons universe. It's nothing homebrew. Mostly. There's some spells in here that are clearly pulled out of the player handbook. We hear them reference places from the actual Dungeons & Dragons setting. And I think more than anything else, I wanted this to feel like a D&D campaign. It's not quite there yet, but it has a lot of the elements that are required to make it feel that way. There is literally a scene where he's just giving his character backstory. And it's also pretty humorous, which, yes, that was a requirement, because D&D campaigns very, very rarely are 100% serious. It's also a fair bit better than the Marvel-style humor that we usually get, which, can I just say, there was like some cosmic shift and now everybody hates Marvel movies? But I am happy to say that this movie tried a little bit harder than that. I get it. The quip-style humor has gotten stale. But this was pretty funny. Another thing that peeves me in a lot of fantasy settings is the lack of decent fantasy races. You'll have your humans, mostly. Then you'll have elves, dwarves, a couple of bad ones, and that's it. I hate that. You're in a fantasy world. Let's get wild. This is why our setting has, like, 87 races. This is one continent. Thankfully, for my overactive world-building imagination, this setting has more than 6 races. You got your humans, you got your elves, you got your dwarves, you got your basics. You also got tieflings. You got dragonkin. You got cats. You got weird bald people. You got owl bears. You got intellect devourers. You got birdmen. You got short people. You got dragons. We're in a fucking fantasy world. Let's have more than 6 races. Now, to be fair, most fantasy worlds are adding more than 6. But I'm not happy unless there's like 12. Minimum. Being a D&D movie itself also offers it certain advantages. Certain things that may hinder other movies suddenly become really, really important. That scene where he's giving us his entire backstory no longer becomes an exposition dump, because this does happen in D&D. It's called character introductions. Certain spells having these arbitrary rules, like you can only ask a dead person 5 questions, or this thing has a range of exactly 500 feet, or the sending stones, one of my favorite D&D magic items, will only work for 1 hour. When you stop looking at it through the lens of a regular fantasy world and actually look at it through the lens of Dungeons & Dragons game mechanics, it stops being a bad thing, because when everything in your world is kinda this arbitrary, you stop kinda questioning it. When the fundamentals of your world just kinda work out that way, it starts making more sense. It's like how there's air in space in Treasure Planet, and it's just kind of always been that way in that universe. You don't really need to question it. And you can't really complain about it either when things are just that different. It also shows that they're not afraid to shy away from the game itself. It embraces its own world and its own community. There's a Critical Role reference in this movie, and I won't say where. And it's just packed full of magic items that could easily be translated into a D&D campaign. I swear to God that the Hither Thither staff in this movie is just some homebrew stuff that the writers came up with because they really, really wanted a portal gun. And hey, I'm not knocking that, because I want that too. And D&D needs homebrew. Without homebrew, life is boring. Yeah, I'm in that camp. Our cast isn't half bad either. Michelle Rodriguez coming off of her 15 million Fast and Furious movies. Sophia Lillis, who was great in Stephen King's It and the less good Stephen King's It Part 2. You got our lead, Chris Pine. He's in everything. You also got Justice Smith here. Yes, Justice, not Justin. I had to do a double take on that. Coming straight at you from the classic movie, Jurassic World Dominion. Another fantastic name here. Daisy Head is playing our villain, who might be a lich, and there's nothing wrong with that. Liches are fantastic fantasy villains. Hugh Grant is here playing the comedic side of our evil duo. It's a very solid bunch of characters, and they all bounce off of each other really, really well. You're doing much, much better than Jack Durgis from Dungeons & Dragons 3. They also put the budget, which was higher than Dungeons & Dragons 3, to a lot of good. These set pieces are fantastic, and I would expect good visual effects from a D&D movie. When someone casts Fireball, I expect a fiery explosion that looks really good and everybody dies. Especially since this movie doesn't use spell slots. They specifically said they weren't gonna use spell slots for this movie because the ability to cast 7 spells a day wasn't going to work for this movie. Now, to be fair, some of the things in people's spell books are ridiculously powerful. I personally have the ability to summon a whole load of spikes that people can't see. I've killed 20 people with those spikes in one battle. So some of this stuff is pretty powerful, but at the same time, there are pacing issues with it. And it doesn't really work for a feature-length film when somebody casts Conjure Barrage and then they have to sleep it off. I think a TV show might have a better time figuring out the pacing on it, but if they did that here, it would be kind of garbage. Speaking of garbage, another smart thing this movie did was no association with those first 3 films whatsoever. This was basically a reboot. We don't acknowledge anything from those first 3 films. We basically pretend they don't exist. It's a soft reboot, but a reboot nonetheless. It's just a different adventuring party running around having fun adventures. Which honestly is not a terrible idea for a movie. Honestly, for a sequel, you could pull in an entirely different cast who are doing an entirely different thing with only vague mentions to what happened in this movie. Which would actually be pretty unique, because that's how D&D campaigns pan out anyway. Campaigns end, and then we make a new character and start a new campaign. It's the natural order of things. And I think this movie understands that. It's not trying to brush off its own community and run off and do its own thing, Netflix, Resident Evil, Halo, because actually trying to appeal to a fan base that you already have instead of trying to run off and do your own thing is a really good idea. Because there's this weird trend of Hollywood writers and directors trying to adapt things while ignoring their own fan base and established lore. They didn't do that here. In fact, there's not a whole lot wrong with this movie. Some of the things in this world seem arbitrary, like the aforementioned you can only ask 5 questions and then the guy goes back to being dead. Yeah, that seems arbitrary, but when everything in your universe is that arbitrary, you can't really question it. I suppose a personal gripe from me is that there could have been more fantasy races. Fae! There are not enough Fae races. I want fauns. I want centaurs. I want furbolgs. Embrace having satyrs in your fantasy settings, I swear to the goddess. It's not that I have a thing for them and you can't prove anything. The flow can be a little bit clunky, but again, we're going off of D&D logic here. In D&D, the flow can get a bit clunky. It can have those giant exposition dumps and we don't question it. That's why this movie can get away with it, because it's not just a movie. It's a Dungeons and Dragons movie. Normally, I would complain about certain elements of this movie, but in the context of Dungeons & Dragons, it actually works. Those sending stones only working for exactly 1 hour seems kind of arbitrary, and it's stupid. That's why in our setting, we turn that time limit off. But when you look at it from the context of this world, it makes more sense. And I know I praised the humor earlier in this review, but some of it might be a tiny bit misplaced. But then again, it's a delicate balance when it comes to humor like this. You don't want a D&D campaign to be overly funny, unless that's what you're going for. And that's clearly what they weren't going for. Clearly not aiming for comedy levels akin to Konosuba or Vox Machina. This one's a little more serious. And there's nothing wrong with that. The only thing that really is wrong with this movie is I feel like there's something missing that's keeping it from being really, really good. This movie is good, but it's not amazing. They do have the potential to make something amazing here, but there's just something missing. And I don't know what that is. This movie has all the right pieces, and it knows how to fit them together, but I feel like a piece is missing. Or maybe that this is only the beginning of some grander D&D adventure, and we can't get too crazy. It's not a perfect movie. No film is. And my standards are really high, but it meets those standards. What would I rate this movie if I had to? And I do have to because it's my job. Well, I figured in true tabletop fashion, we should let the dice decide. You can give yourself advantage on this roll. Yeah, that's around about what I would rate this movie. But I'm also gonna add 0.1. Because that was a really, really good popcorn bucket. And for the first time in the history of this entire show, a fucking popcorn bucket has affected our score. Finally, in the history of civilization, there is a good D&D movie. Not only that, but something they can use to springboard a franchise. They've already announced a TV show. It's witty, it sticks to its roots, it's a good entry point into the franchise, and hopefully, this is gonna make more people pick the game up. Because that's what we needed. We needed a movie that was more prominent than the last 3 movies. D&D is in a really, really good place right now, and we needed a good movie to complement that. This could have been better. Like I said, I still feel like there's something missing in this movie that's keeping it from perfection. But it's still fantastic. And even if you don't like D&D, you're still gonna have a fun time. It's already surpassed expectations at the box office, and I, for one, am glad that they dropped that open game license crap. Because I'm glad that I went to see this movie. And I'm glad that I can recommend this movie to you guys. Definitely hit this movie up for your next trip to the theater. Because it is absolutely worth your time. You see, I can be nice. I can be nice, Wizards of the Coast. I don't have to boycott your film. I can send people to see your film. We don't have to be enemies. And I think they finally realized that. This is good, because I did not want to switch to Pathfinder. My name is Hunter, and this has been a Hunter Review. As of this video going up, Dungeons & Dorkheads Live starts in about an hour, so if you guys want to actually play some Dungeons & Dragons, head on over to our Twitch page. This feels like a natural place to promote the show as well, but we've basically been doing that through this whole video, so instead, we're gonna talk about our D&D sponsors. Like Foundry Virtual Tabletop, who actually sponsor Dungeons & Dorkheads, but we're gonna plug them here anyway, because it is a fantastic virtual tabletop for 5th edition, Pathfinder, whatever you need. This is the same program we use for Dungeons & Dorkheads. Head down to the link below, you can try it out for free. We'd also like to thank Incarnate. Are they sponsoring us? No, but I want them to, but we really like their stuff, so we are gonna sponsor them anyway. This is a map-making tool, and it is an absolutely fantastic site. We use it to make all of our maps. The support staff has been extremely helpful, and we plan on using this for the foreseeable future. Both of these are fantastic programs. Check both of them out down in the description. We'd also like to thank all of our Patreon supporters: Oliver Vickman, Viral Velocity, Death 9000, Madison Woods, the FOE3, Gavin Domenico, Saxy One, and Tribal Typhoon. If you want to be thanked at the end of every single video, consider a Patreon pledge via the link down below. There's a lot of links down below, and I expect you to go to every single one of them. Otherwise, I will die in a cardboard box because I'm broke. Thank you guys so much for watching Hunter Reviews. There is another Hunter Reviews right around the corner. There'll be more details on that in the coming days, but for now, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a terrific day.